my proposition. And you answered me very kindly that I can do what I want. And I will do what is really up to date. And when we heard this morning the echo talks, specifically the interventional talk of Dr. von Badeleben, you will see where the bell rings and where the actual situation moves in the world. So, but before I start my presentation, it will stop between because I have to change over to the echocardiographic program. I want to give a short overview on the quality assurance problems and how to perform a standardized echo, which is different throughout Germany and the world, and I believe also in your wonderful country. Because I believe if one says this is an ejection fraction of 35% and you want to control that inside your department, the others will say this is 45, or the others say this is 25. And we all do not really know what is the limit of confidence we have in what we do. And I will try to go through a very simple case where we check how I do my job and you control how you do it, and perhaps we can discuss a little bit what is the best way to have conformity. So I will just give some short ideas on what is the topic in quality assurance in the world, and that what we have to all our hands is the American Society of Echocardiography, and there we have all these kinds of any prescriptions how to do and what to answer and what questions we have to put. And this is the best book which is out right now for me. And there you can see where you have to examine the patient and so far. And in Germany, it is not to talk German now, but we have just this year edited a manual for the indication and for the performance of echocardiography. And then we have decided, and it's not my decision, that for a normal transthoracic echocardiography, you have to do a long axis, not another long axis, two short axis, and so far and so far and so far. I do not want to go through it too fast, but it is, sorry, I must put you aside here, small, make it smaller. We have in our manual for a standard echocardiographic examination, we thought, not me, but the others thought that 35 loops or images have to be recorded. This is absolutely not possible. And it is just to mention this as an example for how different the standards are in the world. For normal values, it is extremely complicated, not to talk about the volume of the left ventricle, right ventricle, and the differences between men and women, but it is specifically for the mass of the left ventricle and the sizes of the right ventricle where there are huge differences. And we have to write a report. An echocardiographic examination is also very different from one place to the other. And I will just go through it. There is one point which is really interesting and which I want to mention specifically. This is the question if M mode is still important. And all our values that we have all around the world, guidelines for performing a comprehensive transthoracic examination, recommendations from the American Society of Echocardiography, they state that the M-mode routine linear M-mode measurements for quant are not recommended. This is curious for me because all our values and reference values we have at our hands for calculating the mass of the left ventricle for women and for men and for hypertensive heart disease and so far are taken from EMOD. But now they describe also in this book here that you only in rare cases you should use EMOD to quantify the measurements that we all know. This is not at all my personal opinion, and looking around what people do, at least in Germany, is that they still use EMOD as before. And for me specifically, I will show it to you in a minute, the anatomical EMOD is extremely important as a reference value also. Guidelines for performing transthoracic echocardiography is extremely important. I do not want to go through it in details, but one thing which is really important is how to measure the aortic root. We have discussed it in former times already, different times, and I do not want to go too much through it. The normal ranges, for instance, for left atrial strain, this is an example, but for volumes of the left ventricle are completely different. I've just extracted the literature for PubMed, and you see that there are a lot of different reports on normal ranges, and we must discuss that and ask ourselves what standard do we take. And recommended reading on echocardiography can be extracted from the European Society of Cardiology, as well as from all other publications around the world. That what is the basis for all our normal values and for all what we do is this famous paper, Recommendations for Chamber Quantification in adults, and there are normal values given, for instance, for internal diameters, left ventricular volumes, and so far I do not want to go through it, but I just want to state that there are some reference values around the world, but we do not really use it routinely. These are the mass values. I will show you the example. I go through the examples, and there is this question of anatomical EMOD. The normal EMOD is established by the chamber quantification, but as I showed you some minutes ago, it is not recommended any longer to take the EMOD. They prefer to do it with 2D images. I will go through it very fast, and the right ventricle volumes are given here as the method of choice, where we can best see the function of the right ventricle and the volume, but that is absolutely not in use routinely in the world. Okay, normal values. There are some publications out which compare the left ventricular volumes quantification of stroke volume, either calculated by left ventricular outflow tract and by the pulse Doppler from the apical window. We have discussed it last year in depth, and if you compare that to the 2D method, manual tracing, biplane in the 4-chamber view and the 2-chamber view gives completely different values as compared to the 3D values. And then in addition to that, one can take different machines. If you take Tomtec machine from Philips now, or you take a GE machine, you will get different values, and one has to face this situation when we give data and compare our data, for instance, to MRI images and so far. I have no problems with this question, but we must face this problem, and this is very nicely explained here in this paper, which of course I will pass over to you, all this presentation if anybody has interest in it. Okay, so a quality control exercise in the Echo Lab, reduction in inter-observer variability, is that what we need for any study? When we heard the fantastic presentation of Stefan von Bardeleben some minutes ago, he states some data on right ventricular measurements of pulmonary resistance and so far, and you can absolutely be sure that even in invasive measurements there are a large inter-observer variability. And what we tried in Germany with the most experienced laboratories we have in echocardiography, we have given 5 examples of a complete echocardiographic examination, and we have asked the centers to do measurements. It was a disaster what we found out. And I wanted to show you the data, but unfortunately I have not got it from Jens-Uwe Vogt, who is my partner from Leuven in Belgium. But what we found out is that if we have not a standard to measure left ventricular mass, for instance, or ejection fraction, and if we do not educate ourselves together, then we will not have a chance to have the same results. These are similar examinations that have been published some years ago on inter-observer variability, and they discuss that this will be reduced, the inter-observer variability, if one is trained. Vendor neutral right ventricular strain measurements, this has been expressed by anesthesiologists, very recent paper. They did it, as you can see here, from other images than the normal ranges we do in echocardiography. This is an vice versa view, but they showed big differences between the different vendors, and so far, this is a big problem. I will start, if you agree, with echocardiographic images just to show you how I do my job. And I have, first of all, to stop this presentation, and I have to go over to my echocardiographic examination. I hope that I have the chance to do it. Just a minute, stop here. And, oh, sorry, I have to, just a minute, I will be back in a second when I have to, oh, sorry, no, I must go back here. I will start echocardiographic program. I hope that it will work. I'm working with GE, but we have done it with TomTech also, and with the Philips machine. And finally, we should be in the situation that we, oh, sorry, now make it bigger. Bildschirm freigeben. Can you see my screen now? Why? Can you see my screen?
Yes, I see your screen clearly.
Okay, wonderful. So I will show you just how I do my job, and this is the school for Germany, I believe. And now we see how we do it. We start with the 4-chamber view. This is a very simple case with a little bit. I've done this examination just yesterday with a patient which is invited for being ablated for atrial fibrillation, paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. So in general, you will not find very specific pathology, but you see 4-chamber view. It's important to have It's always in the middle of the triangular aspect here. Everybody knows that. And then we have long axis with color, and then we take it with pulse Doppler, and we are somewhat surprised that the velocities are very low here. And we go then to the right ventricle, and which is really important. When Professor Dr. von Badelem spoke about the right ventricle and the tricuspid valve, it's really important to put ourselves the question, how do we measure the function of the right ventricle? I will do it in a minute, but it's just to first of all record the data, and afterwards we do the measurements. Then I go, this is not a typical 4-chamber view. This is somewhat lifted upper position of the transducer to get the right ventricle free wall, which is the interesting part of it. And then we measure, we try to get some idea of the tricuspid valve, as everybody does it. And last year, I have really stressed the importance of the left ventricular outflow tract. How can we measure the output of the left ventricle? And I do not do it in every patient, but it's just for demonstration here again, that we absolutely need to be sure that we have a relatively steep angle between the Doppler line and the flow, so that we can be sure that we have no angle problem. And then the next is that we need a flat velocity profile. I've stressed this last year already, and you see, just looking for this example, that the velocity is not at all homogeneous in the whole area in this region. What we have to find and define in any patient is the subaortic velocity. This works in this case, but everybody knows that if we have an aortic stenosis and you have subvalvular muscular wall here, then you have an accelerated zone here, and it depends extremely where you put your pulse Doppler. This makes differences of more than 50% of the stroke volume that you calculate. So we have to demonstrate that we can rely on this stroke volume. The best way to do is how we normally define it, at least in very specific questions, when we really do not know what is the cardiac output or stroke volume, when we want to calculate aortic stenosis area, for instance, or we want to calculate, I stressed this before already, when we want to calculate the difference between the stroke volume of the left ventricle and that what comes out of the left ventricle, the true stroke volume through the aorta in mitral regurgitation patient. So how we can, if we can use a 3D machine like we do it here right now, I put the left ventricular outflow tract perpendicular to that what we see with color here, and then we have a velocity profile just below the aortic valve, which shows us very clearly that the left ventricular outflow tract is not at all circular shaped. It is in systole. It goes, I can slow it a little bit down, and you can see that in systole it gets round, and in diastole it's oval-shaped. But what is even more interesting is that you can see that the velocity profile is not at all homogeneous in the area where I have met this transaction level. So it must be known to everybody that this is not at all a representative flat velocity profile. in any patient. And this is the problem for everybody who wants to calculate the subvalvular stroke volume. This is a standard, but we must face this problem, and we must not be disappointed when patients with a subvalvular wall here, thickened wall, has very high stroke volumes. We do not correspond at all to that what we expect from these patients. This is just to show, and the other point in stroke volume measurement, which is a problem of quantification, is that we take the position of the pulse, the window for the pulse Doppler here at different positions. I will try to show it where we change the. I just have to take cine loop, and you can see how we change the position of the sample volume throughout the. We change only a little bit here the sample volume position, and you can see how this changes the aspect of the subvalvular velocity. And this gives, in this case, it works. There is not a big difference, but if you evaluate this afterwards, we take this a little bit like that. And sorry, I must start at the beginning, and then we measure it. It's just for to have an idea. I go through it afterwards. You see it measures here in this area. We have stroke volume. You see how we do it. I will comment a little bit. We have 3.3 liters per minute per meter square. We cancel that and we go on to the next one. Oh, it should go on. Oh, this was sorry. I go through it again. It is just to demonstrate what happens. Okay, and I take the measurement again, and it takes. I take this here out. I take this here out, and fortunately, in this case, this is nearly the same. We come to the same value. So we are very happy. It is just to demonstrate how we do it. And I will, in a minute, I will talk a little bit about artificial intelligence or whatever we try to define this pattern recognition of the machines, which must be used in the future because we have so many data that we cannot do it all manually. So to go further, after we have discussed so much the left ventricular outflow tract velocity profile and that what we can extract from pulse Doppler, we go to TVI. This should be done routinely, I believe, in most patients because we have to state diastolic function in the patients, and then we have to do it on the septal side, on the lateral side, and we measure the average of both, and then we try to go to the long axis. That what we see here is not the classical long axis because the aortic valve is too low and the septum is too high, but as we have, and this is that what I stress in the next step, is we take the anatomical M-mode. Normally we take it like that here. Every machine has it today, and we get very nice images as in former times for regular M-mode. That what we can measure now here in the, I can do it just now. We did not do the rest until now because I want to do systematically the strain measurements afterwards. We go to our standard use. I go to the classical left ventricular measurements in M mode. We start with the QRS complex. We must do it here, 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 here. I hope that everybody agrees. So we have a little thickened septum, little thickened posterior wall, and we have, with this internal diameter of 4.8 centimeters, we have a slightly increased muscular mass of the left ventricle, which corresponds to the hypertensive heart disease. This is okay. We take this away, this measurement, and we store it. And now I do it in another way, as the machine asks me just only what I want to measure. I say, please do it automatically, and it does it automatically. But you see what is the result. It is incredible that we had 1.4, we had for the posterior wall 1.3, and this makes a complete different measurement of the, it does it automatically. And everybody, if you do it and everybody in the world does it with my images, you will get exactly these values. But what is correct now? We must face this problem, and we try in Germany at least to standardize the way of how we evaluate the mass of the left ventricle by parasternal recording of the long axis. You see the problem, and this must be standardized because we will find out completely different values. So we prefer, indeed, until now, even if the American Society of Echocardiography and others do not want to use any longer the M mode, we prefer to do it by a standard anatomical M mode. But we can discuss that afterwards. Okay, we go through it, and then we look for the rest of our examination. We have done it from the apex, we have done it from the parasternal view, just a very short view. Then we go to the tricuspid valve, a little bit from parasternal view, and then we try in any patient to get an idea of the ascending aorta, which in this specific patient did not work very well, but we have to have an idea of how thick the ascending aorta is. So this is very deeply now the standard examination, and for the rest we do it in our way, that we look for the vena cava, and if in the vena cava and the specifically in the liver veins we find this kind of flow, which is mainly influenced by respiration, then we can absolutely be sure that the pressure inside the venous system is somewhat surely below 5 millimeters of mercury, if there is no other reasons. And then we measure normally the flow in the vena cava or in the hepatic veins. And the most important, since I've been in Vietnam for the first time, the most important view for overall hemodynamics is this view. There we can directly have an idea of the whole hemodynamics of the patient. We see that there is slightly hypertrophic walls. The right ventricle is very small. The interatrial septum is in the middle, so there is low pressure to fill the left ventricle and low pressure in the right ventricle. So the patient has no venous congestion or filling pressures. He has very good systolic function, and everything is, besides the wall thickness, normal. So going now to the overall measurement of the left ventricle function, we start, as everybody does it, and with the long axis just to have the opening and closing of the aortic valve. We do it automatically, and we say this is AFI, and you see what happens. The pattern recognition does work for the 3 planes which are recognized, but it is completely nonsense what they show us here. We know that other systems, TomTech specifically, does it in another way. This heart model, which is in the world, gives completely different ways of evaluating this here. We must look for that what MRI does. We do it like I show it to you here now, and the softer the inner contour of the endocardium looks, the more difficult it is for the machine to find it out. But we prefer to have it in this line here, better than to put it here. And this is the question of the machine you are using and how you train yourself and how you do your work. So we take it at the inner contour of the endocardium, which we can recognize here very nicely, and we process the data, and you can directly see that there is something which is not completely normal in this area, because it is not completely homogeneous. It contracts better in the apical region as in the basal part here, and there is some typical post-systolic contraction in this area. This is not a single sign of ischemic myocardium. It is quite typically for the geometrical distribution in hypertensive heart disease. We accept that here because we believe that it tracks very nicely. How can we control how well it tracks? It does it automatically, first of all, but we can exclude the color here. And if the lines are more or less horizontal, then we can be sure that there is an acceptable tracking of the system. Going to the next is it takes it automatically. It shows me this is your 4-chamber view, and I do it in the same way. And we all believe, I hope you agree with me, that this is an acceptable quality of the image, but nevertheless, automatical tracking does not work completely well. And then we have global strain only 17%, and we look now for ejection fraction, which is 56. That means that this patient is some 60 years old, has perhaps a little problem with longitudinal contraction, which might be together with his wall thickness, an early sign of myocardial fibrosis, but this is only to keep in mind and look if there are some other aspects of the same thing. So we go further, and I promise to you I will not be so deep with all patients, but we must have a common standard to discuss. And this looks a little bit crazy, but this is for me papillary muscle. I go in here and we then let the machine calculate, and we have then a quite better homogeneous contraction, but still the global strain is a little bit reduced, and we calculate the biplane ejection fraction together with the value of global strain, gives us a very good radial contraction, but a slightly reduced longitudinal contraction, which is more or less pathognomonic of the beginning myocardial fibrosis. We save that, of course, and then we go normally, as you do it, hopefully, in all labs. We take the volume of the left atrium. We can go a little bit just before opening the mitral valve, and then we take the volume of the left atrium in biplane modality, and we go here and here and here and here, and we go here and here and here and here, and we do it in different kinds, area lengths or biplane method of disc. We save that, and we have done it for the tricuspid regurgitation. Just to go very fast to it, this is very easy. This is not what I take automatically. This is not that what I take. I would take this one, and then we save that. And the calculation of the left ventricular outflow tract we have already done. So we have to take the mitral valve, and you see it does it automatically, that it directly says the E to A ratio is 1.6. This is normal, but E wave is very low and the A wave is extremely low. But we take that and we go for the E to E prime. This is very fast, and it's just to demonstrate, and that what we really want to have is that the machine does it automatically and we control it only. So this is E septal, and then we have the next one, which is E lateral. We let it measure again, and we accept it more or less. I take this here out because we have to take that here out, and then we have the right value, but it changes over the respiration, and it is very time consuming and really not very interesting for everybody now, but we have a little bit time, and we must do the same measurements, and you should do it in your laboratory with your team, that everybody does the same. And now we go to the 3D, which is extremely interesting for everybody to have it in the 12 lines. This looks extremely like MRI, and you can do it for 10 cycles. MRI is always only able to do it in 1 cycle, but this is very nicely the characteristic of the left ventricle. You see that there is a good contraction of all kinds. There is a little torsion and squeezing of the ventricle, but you can directly do your diagnosis. You do that just to see it. And for measuring, we have different pattern recognition possibilities, that we let the machine look for the apex. It corrects a little bit the apex. In this case, it was okay. We accept it then, and then it makes these automatical delineations of the different slices through the heart. This is the 4-chamber view, this is the 2-chamber view, and this is the apical long axis. So we can explain to ourselves and to the surgeons who do not want to do much work with evaluation, but they can directly see how the ventricle contracts. This is wonderful. We can go out of that. But what we need definitely is, if the patient should be evaluated for his volume measurements, we could do it in the different aspects of the ventricle, but 3D is always said to be the best method. And now you see what every method, even if you do it with the TomTec device, which directly has a heart model behind, then you must control how that fits with that what you have done manually. And I have done it before already, and I must be very careful now that I have not completely wrong values. you see how I do it. And this is time consuming, and the people do not really want to do it. The TomTech gives directly some values, but nobody really can control it because you cannot change it afterwards. At least you cannot change it very simply. So we do a volume waveform, and we are completely surprised that we at 57% with the automatic ejection fraction from the two planes, biplane, and now we have only, and this, we believe that it shows nicely the delineation, but we must know that with small ventricles, relatively small ventricles, and the thickened myocardium here, this method has limitations with any of these patients. This works very well with patients with a left ventricle of 200 milliliters or so, and with a thinner myocardium, then you get better values. We must all know this. We save this now, and not to really be too much disappointed, I will just show you. I do not know if you can read this data, but I can show you what happens, what you can get out from these values. You get out ejection fraction or a cardiac output of, this is 3D. You can get out a cardiac output of 4.0 liter. You can get a cardiac output of, just a minute, anti-diastolic 4.5 by automatic ejection fraction by biplane. You get a cardiac output of what we have done before of 6.7 liters when you go for left ventricular outflow tract. And so you have differences of more, nearly 40% of cardiac output measurements, and you have seen how I have done it. So I am absolutely sure that in any of your labs, you will have the same problems, and we must face it, and we must decide what for us is the most important. So to be honest from my side, it is very difficult. I put all values in my report, and for me, the left ventricular outflow tract, if I have controlled it in the way as I have shown to you, is from the left ventricular outflow tract pulse Doppler, and I only take the left ventricular outflow tract diameter in this aspect, and it is difficult enough. We didn't do it before. I take this diameter from there to there and take it in as 2.5 centimeters in this case, and I hope that I've done the same before. So I do this measurement just by convention, and I calculate then the cardiac output as I showed you before with the pulse Doppler and the left ventricular outflow tract. It is a pity that we are not discussing face to face now, but I'm absolutely convinced if I tell it in the way of how I do it, everybody outside would say, no, we do it completely different, and I do not understand why you get so different values from your recordings, but it is more or less to be very honest and to face the problems that we have in quantitative echocardiography. And now for ejection fraction, I take the value we get out from the AFI, what I've done before, and I take the strain value as we have done it and seen it before. I hope that this is okay. Now we can do some more calculations of the left atrium and of the longitudinal strain. I just show it. I've done it several times before. This is additional, and I really do not use it regularly, but I do it now because I want to go through one case completely. We have time enough, I believe. And he asked me to call it the 4-chamber view. I do it in the 4-chamber view, and I do it. I know that this is not correct because there is no tissue, but I let it work. And you see directly how it works. You must take the correct for pre-A wave, and then you have exactly what you have in your mitral antegrade flow. You have it here, and you can calculate. It does it automatically. This is the complete reservoir function. This is the conduit function, and this is the booster function. Also reservoir is everything. This is the conduit function. This is the booster function. So there is an E to A ratio, which we have seen before, which is a little bit more than 1.6 or so, because we must, it's nearly equal, we must control it again. But we can take these values. I normally do not do it if I'm not really interested in left ventricular atrial function. For instance, if the ventricle has a large aneurysm, I do not need that because it equals exactly what I see with the mitral valve flow in the standardized mode, and it's much more complicated to do it here. So we go here, we can calculate the ejection fraction. These are all extra values that we normally do not use, 54%. And I go to the 2-chamber view, and I do it in a complete biplane modality. This is by convention. There is no tissue here, but we do it because this is standardized, and it is not really individualized to do. And you see directly it reflects the same what in the what we have found in the 4-chamber view. And if we are in the ejection modality here, then we have similar values. This is not standard. This is research, and we do it routinely in all our patients with atrial fibrillation. And I've spoken about that in Vietnam already years ago when we had this wonderful rhythmology meeting in Hanoi. Okay, so this is what we do for the left atrium, and for the right ventricle, it is that what I mentioned before already. If we want to go deeper into the right ventricle, we must first of all do the measurement of the AFI of the right ventricle. It is 1, 2, 3, and there you can see why it is so important to get the free wall not shadowed by tissue, and the rest is not so important. We process it, and we take these here out. And so we have the free wall, which is all what is less than -20. This is even less, it is -27, 28. Is a normal value, a wonderful right ventricle. And this is what we have to discuss with Stefan von Bardelin when he talked about the tricuspid regurgitation. We will have patients where we discuss it later on. This is a standard view we calculate, and this gives in the same calculation directly the TAPSE with us. So this is the best we can get out for the right ventricular function, though we all know that this is not very well reproducible. It depends on the angle under which you investigate the right ventricle. But we do it regularly, and if we have a true problem with the right ventricle from the structural contraction, I will show you how we do it. Then we take the right ventricle in the 3D plane. Just a minute. So this is the right ventricle. The problem in the right ventricle from the apex is always that the right ventricular outflow tract is not very well displayed. The companies have different ways how to manage it, but they ask you to put the measurement. Sorry, I've done fault. I want to do right ventricle. This company asks you to put the tricuspid valve in the center. This is all a relatively normal case, and I will show you in a minute the pathological cases. But you must at least know where the difficulties might lay, and we must always have the apex in the middle, which is just a little bit fantasy what we do here now, and we must look that we have acceptable visualizations of the short axis here, and then we accept it and we go through it and mark some points, and you see that is absolute no objective values, but at least we can accept that this is the best we can get out of the right ventricle. What we have, we can control it afterwards, but the results are much better than everything we get from the apex in another way. And we take the results, and you see how easy it is possible to look then for the right ventricle. This is the septum part, and this is the free lateral wall. And if you have regional anomalies as a cause for tricuspid regurgitation with RCR infarction, for instance, then you can directly visualize that here, and you have all the measurements you need, and you know that right ventricular fractional area change should be more than 40%. This is difficult to interpret. You had seen TAPSE with the other values were 24 already, and so you must be very, very careful to believe that this is the only way how you can calculate the right ventricle. But this is a very nice way to look for the ventricle, how it works. This is also in TomTec a possibility. They have all their own features to with advantages and disadvantages. But here at least you can show the people that the right ventricle is a little bit large, but it's still okay, and the ejection fraction is okay, area change is quite okay. So you have some measurements, and this is at least for follow-up studies and for detection of extreme forms very valuable. Okay, so I leave you alone with these ideas now, and I go to the next patient. I want just to show you a patient which could be a shock for you. I've investigated this patient yesterday, and it is just to show that we always do the same in all patients. This is the 4-chamber view, this is the 2-chamber view, the long axis, and we go through the values now, and then you can see that nothing is as we wanted it to be in normal cases. There is very often I did not see it during my record. It was done yesterday. There was an extra systole, so the measurements will be a little bit complicated, but you see that there is a very, very bad contraction of the left ventricle, and you have some kind of mitral regurgitation, you have some kind of aortic regurgitation. And for the mitral regurgitation, as soon as there is pathology in the patient, I will directly focus on the pathology. That means I have this as a standard. I see the mitral regurgitation, and then I go in biplane modality. If you have no biplane modality in your transducer, then you must do it one after the other, two-chamber view, commissural view, and the long axis, and then you take it with color, and then you can do your measurements directly from these images. And what are the measurements we do in this patient? Then we are directly also in the mitral regurgitation. And the problem is, how do we define the PISA now? We go to the atrial line here, take from the atrial line the aliasing point, and we have 160 milliliters per second. And this is really arbitrary, because you can also go, this is what we have discussed with co-opt and with Mitra FR. Stefan von Badeleben pointed it out today, but this is not an objective value, what we can get out of this patient. If you realize that it says that the patient has 166 milliliters per second reflex volume, this is incredibly high for that what the patient gets out of this volume of the ventricle. But we measure it, and we measure, of course, the vena contracta, and we are 0.6 centimeters of vena contracta of the mitral regurgitation, which is more or less, with the little pressure we have in the left ventricle, is severe mitral regurgitation. But the ventricle does not put that out. If you look here now for the ventricle, there is this extra systole, or if we take it with the two-chamber view, and you want to get out to AF, and just look for that what the patient gets out. It's just to show you the example and to give you some ideas of cases and how we do our routine work. You have ejection fraction of 60%. This means this patient has, in all, it has 130 milliliters of this huge ventricle. And this is exactly that what is thrown out during, this is more than a second, which is thrown out through the mitral regurgitation. So all these values are not really acceptable. We can only state that there is a vena contracta of 6 millimeters, and that the ventricle is enlarged, moderately or severely enlarged, and has a reduced ejection fraction. I have calculated in the four-chamber view also. I do not want it to do it again, because this is the problem here with the long axis. What do we calculate with the extrasystole? What do we calculate? And everybody does it. Hopefully like that, we take this here as, this is the hinging point here, and we take the tenting area. the size of the ring is not extremely large, and the coaptation height is not extremely large. So this could be the size here. More than 4 centimeters is critical, and the coaptation height for any kind of catheter intervention, if we would decide to do that, is just a theoretical question, should be less than 1 centimeter. And the posterior leaflet, I showed it in my presentation today, should be more than 5 millimeters, the mobile part of the posterior leaflet. This is all not the question here. This is huge, the mobile part of the posterior leaflet, and the anterior leaflet could be measured. It should be always more than 2 centimeters. We have 2.6 centimeters. So this could be a patient for a surgical repair or a catheter intervention. For both methods, it's possible. The question is, and I hope that you all agree with me, that from the patient in all, this is not at all a question that this cannot be done in that patient. We do not know what the patient has. He has get Simdac, Levosimendan. Now he is just transferred to the intensive care unit, and I will show you some more details which can be directly extracted from the echocardiogram. And you, first of all, you see, of course, the thrombus in the apex. We do it later on, I believe, at least we should do it in the 3D aspect, that you can measure the thrombus in all 3 planes. But that what you have to state is what is the reason that there is a thrombus. We do not know, because there is no anterior wall aneurysm. I do not really know why he has this thrombus. He has no problem with anticoagulation or with hyperfibrinogen or so far, but this is extremely dangerous, we believe. We measure the thrombus, and of course we have to look what can be done or what is the rest of the patient, and then we have to fulfill the complete standard, and then you come to the right side. And you see on the right side, we first of all I could not avoid to have a little shadow here. I go to the right side and I do the standard measurement as I did it before. I put it a little bit more to the inner part. I put a little bit broader and I let it process. I believe that this is okay. This could be extracted, and we are a little bit surprised that the right ventricle contracts a little bit better than we have suspected. This is moderately reduced contraction of the right side. But what is the reason that the right ventricle contracts quite well in the moment? This is what we have to find out directly, and you will be not convinced that you have seen one patient from Dr. von Badelem. This is enrolling of the tricuspid valve here, and there are very different measurements of the tricuspid regurgitation. I will summarize that in a minute, but I just show to you how I do these measurements afterwards. I first of all do color in, and you see it is quite obvious that there is truly no limit of, there is no valve, there is nothing which stops the valve, and you, sorry. this is in 2 planes, and then I do it in 3 planes. And how we evaluate the tricuspid regurgitation is, as I show it to you now, we take this in the vena contracta, we put it perpendicular, we put it here in the vena contracta. This is a torrential, this is a huge tricuspid regurgitation. And then we take the color shortly out and we turn it so that we have a true 4-chamber view. You see here's the mitral valve, and then we have an aspect of the valve in the middle of the regurgitant jet, or it's no jet any longer, and then we do our measurements. And which is much more interesting is that we see that the vena contracta of this regurgitation is as large as this here. This is a huge area. So this is a non-existing tricuspid valve, and there is no regurgitation velocity, which merits the name of measuring the pressure in the right ventricle. This is a common chamber. And then we just state that what we do normally in these patients, and this is extremely an extreme tricuspid regurgitation. We are measuring the value, the size of the ring, and this is in the 4-chamber view. We have to do it in the standard way, and this is how I suggest to do it for everybody. If he wants to treat the tricuspid regurgitation, this is the classical tricuspid valve annular diameter, and this is the tricuspid anterior posterior diameter. So this is the ring size already, which is extremely large. You have seen that on the left side, the mitral ring was not so large. And then we are measuring the, putting in the color again. And we should measure in the 4-chamber view, we take the vena contracta, and in the 2-chamber view. And there are values 1.7 centimeters and 3.6 centimeters who are completely out of range. This is one part. This is the valve itself. It is the function of the right ventricle, which we have done already now, which are 2 parts of the story. And then we look for that, what is the consequence of the tricuspid regurgitation. You have seen the images he has shown from Van Henyen, the patient lying in the bed with the thickened legs. But what is the consequence of tricuspid regurgitation? This is a question that I wanted, or I had put to Stefan von Bardelheim, is of course the hepatic vein. And you see the hepatic veins in this patient here, and this seems to be a little bit dilated, but this, in our experience, is not the best way of measuring it. The best way is to look for the flow, and the flow should be integrated in our investigation. And then you can see that there is red flow towards the peripheral dilated liver veins, and we put then in the color remote to really show what happens. And you see that there is respiratory. I must do a little bit more. You see that there is only little respiratory variations, and in each systole there is huge reflux into the liver veins. And this shows us the decompensated right ventricular dysfunction with severe tricuspid regurgitation. The analysis of the venous flow is extremely important for the prognosis of patients with tricuspid regurgitation, as I will show you in a very short summary in a minute, in a series of how we investigate the tricuspid regurgitation. What is now important is to see the flow with the pulse Doppler, and you see exactly the same, that there is a huge reflux in systole, patient is in sinus rhythm. Okay, so what we do now is that we look for the last parameter that we need for the whole story of the patient. We know that he has a severely reduced left ventricular function. There is no regional wall motion anomaly that we have seen. There is the large thrombus. There is the mitral regurgitation, which is functional, which might be severe or not. We do not know exactly. But what we need now is that we have an idea of how much goes out of the ventricle in the to the circulation. And this is what we see, that there is a large variation which corresponds to that what the patient demonstrates clinically. He has a Shane-Stokes respiration, and then we look for the left ventricular outflow tract as we did it before. The valve opening is very short only, and then we measure the left ventricular outflow tract as we did it before. We take this here, you all agree, hopefully 2.2 centimeters left ventricular outflow tract. We save that, and we then go through with the pulse Doppler in this area, and we will measure the left ventricular outflow tract, and this is what we get out. And this is extremely nice if we have the automatic pattern recognition. It does it completely automatically over the whole respiratory cycle, and you see it is a dramatic low output syndrome, which corresponds to the clinical status of the patient. So there goes little out to the circulation. It is everything goes backward through the tricuspid valve, and this was the question I've put to Stefan von Bardeleben. You cannot really calculate under these conditions, in my opinion, the pulmonary resistance, independent of the question if that patient is suited at all for interventional or operational treatment of the valve. So I will give you in a minute, I will just stop here. I want to see you. And why are you still there with me? I'm missing. Yes. Why? Yes. You are still there. Can yes. you please allow me 5 minutes of recreation? I will be back in a second because my daughter from China just arrived, and yes, I will kiss her. I will be back in a second, and I will give a series on how I diagnose tricuspid regurgitation systematically, and then we go further to other cases with aortic stenosis and so far. Is that okay?
Yes, that's wonderful. We will have a short break. Yes.
Short break. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Các bạn chờ 5 phút, giáo sư sẽ quay lại ngay. Các bạn nghỉ 5 phút.
Okay, I'm back. Everything okay? I'm back. My daughter is there. She has no COVID. I have no COVID neither. And now I have to just a minute.
You say your screen. Yeah.
I just a minute. I have this here, and I must go to. So this is what I want to show to you. Do you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Do you see my slides? Huh? Okay, this is a slide. Yeah. Tricuspid.
No, I just see. Sorry, I just see your computer folders, not the slide.
Sorry, I must go Bildschirm freigeben. Do you see the slides now?
Yes,
it should.
Yes.
You see the slides, huh? Is that okay?
There's the slides there. Thank you.
These slides, yeah? Okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, you see the interventional therapy of tricuspid regurgitation. Is that you can see that?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay. Wonderful. So what I want to, I do not really want to talk about that what Stefan von Barthelheim has shown us already, because it is not really difficult to clip the tricuspid or to put in a valve from the surgical side. We must understand, and this is much more complicated than the mitral valve, for instance. And mitral valve is already complicated, but the simplest valve is the aortic valve. If the aortic valve is too stenotic to take it out, or if it is regurgitant and the ventricle is large, then you have to replace the aortic valve. But for the mitral valve, for the primary mitral valve, this is okay. There you must repair or replace it. But for functional, we have already the problem that we do not really know if that is good for the patient. And Stefan von Barthelheim, he has huge numbers, but we know, each of us knows patients where the functional mitral regurgitation is not to be treated at all. I have pointed it out in my talk this morning. But for the tricuspid, it is the most difficult valve to understand and to treat, perhaps. So it is not to take away the leakage of the valve. The problem is, what is the reason for the tricuspid regurgitation? Everybody now wants to treat the valve, and this is what I show to you. It's not really difficult to put in this. This is here with the mitral clip device, the Trialign, what Stefan Barthelheim has shown us, and Professor Zinning, who is my follower at my hospital, and Dr. Nguyen, and they do all the job together there. This is, one can do it, but it's the question if it really helps the patient. This is large PCR. This is in Asia, it will be exactly the same. Everybody wants to do it, but we do not know if it's really good. We must differentiate the etiology of tricuspid regurgitation and the primary tricuspid regurgitation are very few cases. He has shown us the one patient he has shown us with the carcinoid. We have seen it, Hedinger syndrome. Stefan von Barthelheim has shown where he has put in the prosthesis by via catheter intervention, and he has also mentioned the pacemakers. We were very optimistic when we thought that we take out the pacemaker leads and then the tricuspid regurgitation would disappear, but it doesn't work in the world. It doesn't work. Morbus Barlow, I will just show it. Endocarditis is very often a problem for the tricuspid valve, but even if you cut out the tricuspid valve in endocarditis, in drug addicts, for instance, you will not have really hemodynamic problems. But the problem in the tricuspid regurgitation is always the secondary tricuspid regurgitation. When you have a trauma of the tricuspid valve, I've seen people which have an accident 20 years ago and they had normal lives, and after 20 years they got the atrial fibrillation. Then they had to be treated, but not before. And the abstain is only interesting in cases where you have added an ASD, a large ASD, or you have rhythmologic problems or VSD, for instance. So the primary tricuspid regurgitation, if that is all what the patient has normally no hemodynamic problems. Even patients with carcinoid syndrome, they have also pulmonary regurgitation, then they can stand that for a very long time. Secondary is much, much more complicated due to ventricular dysfunction. This is rare, but if you have a large RCA infarction, then you might have, I will show one example with that in a minute, or as for the left ventricle, ventricular dysfunction, or due to atrial fibrillation. This is extremely interesting that the patients with atrial fibrillation and a left-sided mitral regurgitation, as I showed you this morning with mitral regurgitation, functional mitral regurgitation, they are completely different in their hemodynamic understanding. And regional dilation of the tricuspid ring is different causes for that, but I will go through it in a minute. So this is typically Epstein's anomaly. This is, I have not seen so many patients in my career in adult cardiology, but this is a typical patient, had no problem at all. She had rhythm problems, and she had an open interatrial septum and had to get an occluder there, but the mitral regurgitation was completely unimportant for her. This is the patient I told you before. Sorry to have it in German now. Here she is 71 years of age, and she had an accident on bike at her age of 14 years. And at that age only, some 45 years later, she was then symptomatic. The valve was destroyed. She had severe tricuspid regurgitation, and she was nearly asymptomatic. And this is endocarditis, of course, yeah, and this is Barlow of the mitral valve, and the same patient had a Barlow of the right side. This must be respected, and then this is primary tricuspid regurgitation. So this is pacemaker-induced tricuspid regurgitation. This is fixed to the valve, and we thought in former times that it is useful to extract the lead and then the tricuspid valve would recover, but it is not true, because first of all, there is FPEF situation or whatever, and then the pacemaker lead is fixed. It is directly stick to the valve, and if you take the lead out, then the valve is completely destroyed. We have seen that several times. Right atrium and major tricuspid angular function. This is one of the best publications of the last year, 2021, and you should really read that if you are interested in the right side of the heart. This is Denisa Muraru. She's living from Romania. She's living with Badano in Italy, and she has done a wonderful work. She has shown that the relationship between the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and the left atrium is a reversed relationship. This is normal. Both is normal. The size is normal of the ring is normal, and there is no tethering. If you have atrial fibrillation, then you have a large ring and you have the largest atria. So there is a good contracting right ventricle and a flattened ring which is enlarged. And this is completely different. This is like this is for those who want to treat these patients, they must really see that the right ventricle is okay, and one can rely on the right ventricle. It is much more reliable than, for instance, in pulmonary hypertension. In pulmonary hypertension, in pre or post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, there is a larger right ventricle which is dilated already, which has a more or less beginning reduced ejection fraction and a large tethering, and the ring is normal size and the right atrium is small. All that is extremely interesting for those who treat these patients, because you can imagine that treating this ventricle with that valve is much more successful than to treat this ventricle with that tethering, even if the tricuspid regurgitation would not be so severe here. I tried to discuss that with Dr. von Bardelem, but he did not accept it because he said, we measure in any patient the Wood resistance of the pulmonary circulation, and then we know what we have to do. This is not so simple at all, because all those who do the job, not technically only, but who see the results of the patients, see that they could not really see in advance what the result of repairing the leak here will really give. They can be worth afterwards than before, or they can extremely profit of that. I will show you examples of that. This is the volume overload with tetralogy follow with the pulmonary leakage, which is completely normal sized left atrium, normal sized ring, but this due to the volume of the right ventricle gets a relative tricuspid regurgitation. This is extremely interesting, and I show you also, by the way of how Denisa Muraru quantifies the tricuspid regurgitation. And this is what I absolutely prefer, her way of doing it, what we do. And I know Denisa Muraru very well. And what she does is that she transects, you have seen it with me with the very large tricuspid regurgitation in the decompensated heart of last patient, and she transects the vena contracta in smaller parts here, and she's looking for the smallest area of the tricuspid regurgitation. And this is the vena contracta here, and you see the septal. This is transthoracical echocardiography. This is the septal leaflet, this is the anterior leaflet, the posterior leaflet. We have seen, Dr. von Barthelem has shown us that they are saying that many patients have a quadrisped with 4 leaflets, tricuspid valves. In those cases where you have a large tricuspid ring, this makes a separation of the anterior leaflets. So this might be the case here also. But it's quite obvious that you cannot measure the tricuspid regurgitation only by one diameter or the second diameter, as I did it some minutes ago. You see how it works, and this is absolutely my favorite, that we transect the tricuspid regurgitation flow, and we look for the vena contracta, and then the inside the vena contracta, we delineate the size, and then we have an idea. But this is not standardized modality today. She has shown several examples. It's actually what I have shown you before, and this is disastrous tricuspid regurgitation. So this is now my example, I believe. This is my example. No, it's not my example. So I will go further. This is how we do it. Okay. So sorry, I must go back again. Sorry. I've done the same one. I wanted to show it to you, how we do the examination of the tricuspid valve, and this is exactly the same. You see the leaflets, and it's always the same. So we go through the leaflets then, and we have exactly the same what she has shown to us. So computer tomography is how we could repair the tricuspid valve. You have seen it. This is from Professor von Barthelem. He has shown similar images, exactly that what you have seen before already. This is very nice, but I believe you can exactly do it by echocardiography. And what is the question now is, how do we grade the regurgitation inside the valve by the vena contracta? And I must say, she takes a 3D. Nobody really talks about this here. This is Rebecca Hahn. He has mentioned it already before. 3D vena contracta, quantitative AOR, and I must say this is much too small if we want to grade really different kinds of severity. And you must find your own standards in grading the size of the vena contracta. I must confess, on the other hand, that for me personally, here's my example. You see it again. This is in 2 planes, and you see the vena contracta. You see wonderful the valves, and you see here the vena contracta in 3D. And then in 3D, we evaluate it in the way as Denisa Moral it does. It is not very difficult to do it, but I must confess that the absolute values of the vena contracta, as in the mitral valve, by the way, the absolute values either for this diameter, and you put in the color in a second again, this diameter, as I did it in the one example, or the area is not the most important. The most important thing we have, indeed, is the function of the right ventricle. I have shown to you before. It is very easy now for you. And I did it with the 3D. I have shown it to you. You must show how good the ventricle contracts. I've shown you the example in my case. This is how we do it. But the most important thing for me, for characterizing the compensation of the tricuspid regurgitation, is the liver flow. And I will show you two examples in a second where severe, very severe tricuspid regurgitation is perfectly compensated, and you have a wonderful physiological liver vein flow, and you have a moderate or even slighter tricuspid regurgitation where it is completely decompensated. And you all know patients with a bad right ventricle where you have congestive heart failure, you have congestion of the liver veins, even without tricuspid regurgitation. So the degree of compensation of right ventricular dysfunction, diastolic dysfunction, is directly to be depicted from the liver vein flow, and as it is just now last week published, you can also take as a parameter for the prognosis of treating a tricuspid regurgitation, you can directly take the liver enzymes gamma GT and GOT and GPT, which are also very characteristic. If they increase in values, you all know that if you have more than 1,000 units per liter transaminase, then the prognosis of the patient is very bad. You must give lots of diuretics and so far. The physiological liver vein flow shows phasic waves like you see it here, and it's wonderful to see that it is respiratory changeable. And then if you have a patient, as we showed it in the patient just a minute of my clinic of yesterday, then you have severe, this is atrial fibrillation, but severe systolic regurgitation, wide in the peripheral. The question, which patient profits of tricuspid valve repair, tricuspid regurgitation treatment, is not at all solved right now. And what Stefan von Barthelem told us, that he measures in any patient the resistance is done by his group. This is a very big German cooperation between Berlin and with Leipzig and Munich, and they have the highest numbers in the world. But this is not at all that what can really be the guideline for the world right now. Precapillary dominant pulmonary hypertension showed an unfavorable prognosis, what he told us, and we do not know it in advance. I will show you an example. This is a patient who got a pacemaker, DDD pacemaker 4 years ago, had a lead dysfunction. You see something is wrong here, and the patient was extracted, the patient lead was extracted, and at that time when the lead was still in, there was no severe tricuspid regurgitation. We extracted the lead, and you see we completely destroyed the valve. You see there's a severe tricuspid regurgitation inside the valve. It is severely destroyed, but looking for the liver veins, there was no, this is in the tricuspid regurgitation, but looking for the liver veins, you had no problem at all. And we put in a valve. There is a slight stenosis afterwards, and he recovered completely, and everything is okay in this patient. You see, extremely torrential tricuspid regurgitation, no problem to put in a valve, and everything will be okay. And this is another case where you have an RCR infarction some 20 years ago with little problems, ICD due to secondary prevention, and he came to us. He had a severe tricuspid regurgitation. What is the reason for this tricuspid regurgitation? Is the RCA infarction. This is not the lead. The lead inside the tricuspid valve is completely liberal, it's free. And what we have done is that the surgeon has put in tricuspid ring, and he has put in, and this is before operation. You see that there is paradoxical motion of the septum and the akinesia of the lateral wall. And then what the surgeon has done, he has put in a ring, and with the ring inside, the problem have been solved so far. We have still regurgitation, but the patient has completely recovered, but only because we did not completely resolved it for the leak of the valve. We left moderate severe tricuspid regurgitation to give the left ventricle and the right ventricle the chance to really recompensate a little bit better step by step, and to put the volume of the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery. He now has a slightly pulmonary hypertension. The left ventricle has the inferior infarction, but this is what we call, this is the adaptive right ventricular ring annuloplasty. Not to put in a prosthesis, make it completely leak-free, because then the patient would have died, but to do some adaptive ring annuloplasty. I hope that you understand all the story, and this is what Stefan von Barthem, this is his own work. This has just appeared now. You can see what you can all do with the tricuspid valve, but I want to stress again that it is not the question if the surgeon or the interventionalist does something to the valve. It is the question to which degree you should reduce the regurgitation, and this can only be decided if you know the pathophysiology of tricuspid regurgitation, looking for the wonderful images of Denisa Murao and looking to the history of the patient, left-sided problems with HFpEF and mitral disease, aortic disease, and so far. If you cannot do anything on the left side of the heart, you must concentrate on the right side, and then you must look how the tricuspid regurgitation is compensated. And remember my two cases, one where it is absolutely compensated, whereas there is a severe tricuspid regurgitation, and the other with also severe tricuspid regurgitation is not at all compensated. Okay, so this is my message to the tricuspid regurgitation, and I would go further with examples. Just you asked me, oh, sorry, you asked me, oh, sorry, I go out of that, I stop that. And any question for tricuspid regurgitation? You have understood everything? It's a very hot topic, but it is interesting, and I hope that we can talk the same language on the tricuspid regurgitation. All you need for tricuspid regurgitation, to my eyes, is basic understanding, but it is very nice to have a 3D machine, and transthoracic 3D with 3D good image quality is essential for having an idea on the vena contracta. Okay, so I will do further examples. I have to look for Bildschirm freigeben. So I must go echo pack. So we go to other examples. I want to show you one. I'm talking only of my patients of this week. This is not because I know them better. This is a young lady. You don't speak German, so I have the true name of the lady. A young lady, 57 years of age, and she has had an LAD infarction, but she came to the hospital only about 3 days after the infarction had passed. And now we go through it, and I hope that you all follow me now. We had the topic we have talked a little bit on atrial fibrillation with mitral regurgitation. I have a little bit talking about the strain analysis, and I will add something on the atrial fibrillation at the end of this example. So, yes, I will add something on atrial fibrillation. Now I'm on coronary artery disease. And coronary artery disease specifically is one major application field for strain analysis. So we just look for what we can see from that patient, and you see that just taking these 3 images as a first step, you see everything. Is that okay for you? So what we can see is that from here on, this proximal LAD occluded infarction, all that does not move correctly, and you see the septal part does not move correctly until there, and you see that the anterolateral part is not moving at all, but this is moving very nicely. So what we see in all these patients with anterior wall infarction is that everybody says that they have a good ejection fraction, but I do not believe that really. And so let us do it together and discuss a little bit what could be a better risk stratification of these patients. So what we do at first is that we do AFI, and you should be aware of the situation that you only take this part of the septum and not that part, because then you will get wrong interpretation on dyskinetic areas. Okay, so we do the processing, and it's quite obvious that the anterior wall is completely dyskinetic in the proximal part, or akinetic and post-systolic contraction. It is a fresh infarction, and this is pathognomonic, and we do it as everybody does it. We go to the next to the 4-chamber view. This does the machine automatically. We take that away. Okay, we cover the whole myocardium, and we do the processing. And this is much more in the 4-chamber view. You see that there is a dyskinetic area of the apical region, okay? And post-systolic contraction is reflex, and this is quite well. These parts are well contracting. This is quite obvious, obviously to demonstrate, and you have the rest of it is the 2-chamber view. it is not useful to put it in the area where we have no echoes. Okay, dyskinetic in a large area. So we do it the bullseye, and this is typical for an anterior wall motion infarction. And what is interesting to know now is, oh, I've forgotten to, sorry, Ansicht aus, two-chamber view, yes. And I want to two-chamber view ejection fraction. And the four-chamber view, I have ejection fraction. So we have 38%. This is already moderately reduced ejection fraction. But if we look then for the global strain, 7.8, less than 9% is severely reduced anyway. This is not so typical for the anterior wall motion infarction, because normally ejection fraction is calculated as the radial function, much better than the longitudinal strain. And we have to think over in the future, at least for older anterior wall motion infarctions, if that is really okay, that we take the radial function, which is mostly reflecting the basal part, as the prognostic factor. This is extremely important for deciding if the patient gets a prophylactic ICD, and we are just elaborating the question of patients with a severely reduced longitudinal strain and only moderately or slightly reduced ejection fractions are more to be judged in terms of risk of ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation by the longitudinal strain. This is ongoing task force, and my personal belief is, with all our experience we have, that the longitudinal strain is much more prognostic relevant than the regurgitation fraction. This is discussed all over the world now, and I want to show you something which is interesting, because I have not the time to show you other examples now for resynchronization therapy. I will show you how we are evaluating the work efficiency. We call it, the patient had 100 to 60 millimeters of mercury. So we call this the work efficiency of the patient. How do we define the work efficiency? This is only possible if we look for the strain pressure loops. This is exactly the same as the, you see, this is pressure dimension loops we know from physiology, and then we know that the whole ventricle works like that. Yeah, we must calculate the area in between, and it calculates the pressure, and this is the diastolic function, this is systolic function, opening of the aortic valve, and this is the closing of the aortic valve, and this is the diastolic area. So here we can differentiate the different areas of the ventricle in, we can do it primarily, it's interesting for CIT, for resynchronization, and for left bundle branch box patient, but what we call the hemodynamic situation in patients with an anterior wall motion infarction is that they have an intraventricular shunt. Looking for the different contributions to this overall work is that we have a large temporarily changed contribution, but this is a complete wonderful loop. Here we have a complete wonderful loop. Here we have a complete wonderful. But if you go to the middle, you see that the loop is the other way around. That means that the ventricle in systole has, except in addition to the left ventricular outflow tract and aorta, has a shunt. It moves volume from the base to the center of the infarction. And this is the intraventricular shunt, which is hemodynamically extremely ineffective. And this gives the global work efficiency of these patients. And this is 79 is extremely low. The normal work efficiency of patients is at least 92 to 94%. That means every part of the ventricle should have the same loop. This is just interesting, and this is a little bit academic in your eyes, perhaps, but this is extremely interesting for talking about prognosis in patients with an infarction. And the lowest work efficiency is seen in the patients with anterior wall motion infarctions. And this is why the prognosis of the LAD infarctions are the worst, at least in echocardiographic terms. This patient has other interesting parts, and if one patient has large anterior wall motion infarction, we look, as for every patient, we look, of course, for the diastolic function, first of all. This is diastolic function, and we measure it, and we are very surprised that the E to A ratio is okay, and the deceleration is okay, and the patient, I can tell it to you now, she has no complaints. She says she has no respiratory stress syndrome, and so far, so this is okay, but we must be careful, and I hope that I have done it. We must be careful if that is a pseudo-normalized diastolic function. So we look for the TVI, and this is exactly the same. So we can state in that relatively young lady with this large anterior wall motion infarction that diastolic function is not really disturbed. So we believe that the filling pressures of the left ventricle are not very high. I hope that you all agree with me. I do not want to go too much into details because we have not time enough, but I want to show you other things also of that patient. And that is that the anterior wall, she has the small mitral regurgitation. This is a functional mitral regurgitation. It is mostly seen in posterior wall infarctions, but in this specific case, this is also due to stretched cords, and this is why when we do all our measurements, you have seen how we are measuring the ring size and how we are measuring the tenting area, and then it is obvious that there is some stretching because normally the valve looks like that. So this is functional mitral regurgitation, but this is not really, obviously not very severe. But I want to show you some other things on that patient, which is the right ventricle. Unfortunately, there is some shadowing here, but this is for the output, sorry. I wanted to show you the right ventricle. There's the right ventricle. What is really interesting in this patient is that she has part of the right ventricle which is included into the anterior wall motion, a normally dyskinetic area. And this should be stated from the beginning. This is in a large, until depends on the distribution of the coronary arteries, but you should state that when you examine these patients. And of course, what we do, all you have seen it before. I look if I have done it. I will do it again for with you. I will do the right ventricular strain for the free wall, and then you can see it very nicely, and you should state that this is the basis contracts very severe. It makes overall contraction which is normal, but TAPSI is not very high because this part here is not contracting. This is a complicated LAD infarction with contribution or distribution to the right ventricle. It is interesting just to see that it exists, and she will surely have very little systolic pulmonary pressure. Hopefully, I believe you see it here, you are measuring it, and it is normal pressures. This is a consequence of the, this is quite, we must accept that, we must state it, and I would have believed that the pressure is lower. But this is nicely to see, and we do this also as we did it before in the 3D, and I hope that I can demonstrate it to you, that we have another application of 3D volume measurement. This is very fast. I put it here. You know now how the system works. You go a little bit here. It should work now. This is some training, but it then works well. And we take it here and take it here and take it here, and take it here and take it there. And then I believe that everything is okay. I would try to, but I believe that it's okay. And we take the results, and I hope that I can document that this area does not move at all. You see it? Right ventricle. This is pumping this is like stress echocardiography. You should really look for that. Okay, so this is strain analysis of the cardiac, of coronary artery disease. I hope that it will suffice for the LAD. I have so many examples where I can show you the same coronary status, but completely different cases. But this is a specific case, and you should mention that the right ventricle is included in the infarction area. I would like to show you some atrial fibrillation. We have still, tell me, when will we have 1.5 hours. Is that correct? Why?
Yes, yes.
We German.
1 hour and 1.5 an hour.
1.5 hours. Yeah? Okay, okay. So we continue to work. Have you questions? Has anybody questions to that what we have seen now? But I hope everything is clear and you have seen the examples, and so we can. Yeah, TAPSI is the same value, by the way, and right ventricular function is low, and the ejection fraction by the hyperkinetic proximal part is normal. This is exactly that what we have seen from the left side, that the ejection fraction radial function is okay, but the overall function is reduced. Okay, so I would like to go out of that, and I would show you for the atrial fibrillation something. Okay, I go out of that, and I have just a minute. Yeah, okay. I must tell you a story. Okay, I will give you, I go out of that patient here now, and I will tell you something on, sorry, I go out, I stop that, and I go, wo kann ich jetzt Bildschirm freigeben? Sorry. I must go. Can you see it now? There are coronary arteries. Can you see it?
Just the photos, not just the files, not the slides.
Oh, sorry. I must stop. Sorry, I must Bildschirm freigeben. And I go there. Can you see the slides now?
Fixed.
You see the coronary arteries. Is that okay? Okay?
Yes, wonderful.
So you see, this is a 71-year-old man with acute left heart decompensation in November of last year, atrial fibrillation, arterial hypertension. He had pulmonary edema when he was admitted to the neighbor hospital, and he came to us, and he was admitted for coronary bypass and for mitral valve repair replacement. So this is coronary artery, right coronary artery was occluded, left coronary artery, I must put that away. Left coronary artery was right coronary artery, chronic total occlusion, don't know. And they told us that this year was a 75% stenosis. One could discuss that. We did not discuss that. We accepted the images they have sent to us of that patient, and that patient had this regurgitation. And for me, as you are informed now from my talk this morning, it is a typical pseudo, these are not my images, pseudo Barlow, because this is this indentations, and within these indentations there was this regurgitation. So we accepted this regurgitation as moderate to severe, and the heart team decision was bypass and mitral valve reconstruction. Bypass, this is what we saw when the patient came in, and with the chronic right coronary artery occlusion, we could not really see a severe scar. I go back again. You see this here. I will show you the original images. This is just the slides. Yeah, this could be the scar. We could discuss that. And what happened to us, this is, we do not see a fresh infarction. No? This is quite obvious. We have seen it with the, okay. And then we have seen the mitral regurgitation. The mitral regurgitation it is with atrial fibrillation. It's quite obvious. This, when he was accepted to our hospital, he had severe regurgitation. We did measurements, all in all, this is okay, this was okay. And we found a ERO of, you see the original images in a minute, and you have the regurgitation volume, which we normally do not calculate, but we are happy and say everything is okay, we repair the valve. Yeah, and this is that what we have seen in our understanding. This is what you all know. This is the mitral regurgitation, and this is what we have measured now. We have all the same calculations, and we had tricuspid regurgitation with very little and at normal pressures, and the cardiac output was okay, so that we were happy to say that the patient had that the patient had severe mitral regurgitation and the patient had coronary artery disease, and this was a good indication to operate that patient. What happened? I must put that out. I must go again, Bildschirmteilen. I go here, and I show you again these are the values when we saw the patient for the first time. We sent him home, and we wanted to defibrillate the patient for atrial fibrillation, and we wanted to give him heart failure drugs. He had no drugs until that moment. He went home, but he did not take the medicaments, the drugs. He came back, and he still had the severe tricuspid regurgitation, and he was still in atrial fibrillation. And I thought everything is okay. He has a little better contraction, but then everything was the same as before. And then we asked him really to take the drugs, and he had some infections, so that we could not operate him. And we saw him. This is, you see, it was the 25th of November, and we saw him 3 weeks later. He came back to our hospital, and then look what happened. This is the status when he had the drugs, and he came back and had no mitral regurgitation. This is a critical question. You see, he had obviously atrial fibrillation induced mitral regurgitation. He came back and had nearly nothing. This is nothing left from. He has very little pulmonary pressure. This is for the mitral regurgitation. You can even not see the mitral regurgitation. You just have a very short early systolic reflux, and you add in diastole, you have as a typical sign of not important mitral regurgitation, the reduced E to A ratio. Everything okay? You believe that this is not a severe tricuspid regurgitation. So what had we to do? It is not any longer a surgical case to repair or reconstruct this little regurgitation. Cannot be repaired, should not be repaired. And for the coronary arteries, you have seen that is a chronic total occlusion of the right coronary artery, and the LAD stenosis is not really so severe. So what to do with that patient? You do not see anything which is a severe scar. Okay, so there is something in the LAD. Perhaps what we did is that we put them on a bike, stress echocardiography. And what happened is that he only was able to force for 75 watts. And what happened, this is under resting conditions, this is under 50 watts, and this is under 75, and this is after, and take after nitroglycerin also. So we must all discuss, and this is one of the hardest problems in echocardiography, to judge stress echocardiography. But you all agree, hopefully, that there is some kind of hypokinesia, but this is more important under stress to my eyes, and the posterior wall is okay. And the most important thing is that after nitroglycerin, there you have really an increase in contraction amplitudes. Okay, so there might be some ischemia, you know, the coronary status, and 70%, we have heard these discussions of Zinning today, of ischemic relevance and of FFR measurements and whatever, and IVUS on OCT, but stress echo is much more important. So obviously he has some problems with the LAD, but looking now for the RCA, is that what we see here. This is anterolateral, 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 and you see that it is hypokinetic, and after release, there is upcoming again the contractility here, and for the true RCA area, you see that there is some kind of dyskinetic area very shortly, but it's not typically ischemic response. So there is no true ischemic response to the CTO, but there is some curious kind of anterolateral and anterior septal hypokinesia as an equivalent to ischemia. So what we do then, we have the 4-chamber view. And again, we could have expected that the RCA would show up here, but did not do. The anterior wall is that here, and again, it looks a little bit like LAD, but we are not very sure. So what we have is that in the 2-chamber, in the long axis, and in the 2-chamber view, we have some kind of LAD, typical ischemic answer, and we had no RCA ischemia. This must be discussed, and we must all have these examples to play with it, and we must judge it independently from each other, and then we have better results, concordant results. But what did we with the mitral regurgitation? Isn't it surprising? We started with really near 0, and this is even more important when you look for the 2-chamber view. And here again, as before, we see that this is a pseudo-Barlow, and we have 1, 2, 3 indentations. And after release of the stress echo examination and after nitroglycerin, there's nothing left. This is a critical question. What can we do with that patient? But first of all, we have to fulfill our job for the stress test, and you must measure under stress conditions the pulmonary pressure. And this is what we find under stress, under resting conditions, under rest. Then we go on, we measure stress here, there, then we measure here, then we measure here under maximum stress, and then we measure back again here. So what we found is that the pressure in the pulmonary artery went up from 24 under resting conditions to 41 under 50 watt and 70 and 47, 49 millimeters of mercury plus central venous pressure under stress. So what is your decision? This is one part of the story, your decision, and what was my decision, my proposition. This was confirmed also by the strain analysis. You see, this is under resting conditions, and this is what we saw under stress, you remember, and this is after stress. So there is some kind of scar, hypokinesia, in the in that area which has not completely recovered. The overall contraction is not very high, but this is an ischemic response, absolutely ischemic response. So that it is an indication to do something on the LAD. RCA, we did not see anything, and we had the primary hypertension under stress, under very little stress, under 75 watts, and we had the mitral regurgitation. What is your decision? My decision, proposition as a cardiologist to my surgical department was, okay, do what the task was before, do a bypass on the RCA and do a bypass on the LAD and mitral valve, treat the mitral valve, put in a ring. We have done that, and this is what came out. Patient had a V block, first degree, which recovers hopefully later. You see that the E, you have this AV block that makes that the E and A wave have a confluence here, but you can differentiate. So he has still this atrial contribution to left ventricular filling. You know, it is, by the way, it is a surgical operation. It is a cardiac surgical operation. So it is not so easy to do it with the patients. Of course, with a mitral ring, you see a physio ring, nothing leaks any longer. And with the left ventricular function, I must look if I have done the, I hope that I have done this here. It is the same as before, sorry. It is not really changed. This is for bypass surgery. It is quite normal that nothing changes if it is operated carefully and not too long with the heart-lung machine, but you see still the global strain is reduced. It is a difficult question, and I would like to go to just that case together with you to the guidelines and to defend my proposition to the surgeons. And the patient is lucky that he has survived the operation, but I really do not know if we have done something from the prognosis very effective for the patient. I will go through the literature together with you. I must stop that here, and I stop that, and I must go again to my Bildschirm, and I must go to here, and you see my screen. Hopefully you see my screen. So this is what you have seen in the original version. And these are the guidelines. For these patients with valvular, this is, I must go back, the newest guidelines for the management of valvular heart disease in Germany or in Europe, and the same is true for the American Society of Echocardiography, which is together with the South Asian Society, yeah, they all write the same. Exercise stress testing, examining the exercise capacity and blood pressure response, is of prognostic value in patients asymptomatic valve disease and provides further information of the timing of a potential operation intervention. Nothing more. In former guidelines in 2017, there was described that you should in any way do stress tests to decide if the patient should be operated on the valve, yes or no. This was a 2B indication. This is taken out because so few people do stress tests for valvular heart disease. And this is the same in the guidelines, and the same is true for integrative echocardiography. CMR stress testing should be done, yeah, but it is not really decision making. And the same is true for the guidelines for the management of patients with valvular heart disease for Americans. Stress testing or invasive transesophageal echocardiocardiac calibration testing to determine optimal treatment strategy. This is nothing. And in the literature, this is what we have done. Sorry, you have seen that already. So prognostic value of mitral regurgitation, there are hundreds of papers out who deal with the question if stress test is of prognostic importance for patients with mitral regurgitation. And this is the only paper out. It is from 2008. And this is interesting that they have said that if the pulmonary pressure increases to 60 millimeters of mercury, and this was just the case in that patient because it was, you remember, 57, we have measured 57 plus central venous pressure. This would surely be that. And they say that it must be lowered. They have, this is a wonderful paper, that if they could reduce, even if the patient has 50 millimeters of mercury, this is of prognostic value. This is a fantastic work, retrospective work, where they have done enough stress tests in mitral regurgitation. The decision if the size of the mitral regurgitation or the severity, whatever that means, has increased under stress has not really been discussed. There's only one paper out of Lancelotti in Germany, which was cited always, but this is not important. Prognostic value of peak exercise stress primary pressure is the same. What I've seen, 50 millimeters of mercury is extremely interesting. And fortunately, we have seen that the patient has not suffered from the operation. So I'm quite happy that the operation was performed. And I really do not know if the prognosis is really good. Okay. did I try to explain what I thought when I will stop that here, and I will go again. I will go again to the question was, this was atrial fibrillation induced mitral regurgitation. First of all, I thought. And obviously, after we had given him to optical medical therapy, one side, and the other, he was in sinus rhythm. There was no mitral regurgitation at all at the end. And then we did our stress test, and we had these difficult to answer questions. He had a pulmonary hypertension, which was surely due to coronary artery disease, perhaps, and he had an increased mitral regurgitation. We can vote who would have, even if material question, financial this operation would not play a role in Germany. There's no question. Everybody will be operated when doctors say that he must be operated. But I really do not know if that was the right decision for the mitral valve, at least. We have not done wrong for the patient in general, but this is not a very simple question. So I have another question for mitral regurgitation, which is really interesting. And I will just show you a very short example. Oh, I must go. Therefore, my remodeling and sinus rhythm. This is here. This is very short, 3 images.
So the slide.
You saw not the slide. Just sorry, I apologize. I must atrial fibrillation. Stoppen. Und dann nochmal. Just a minute. Just a minute. This is okay.
Yes.
This is okay. And I will just show you what our idea is of. I don't know if I've shown it last year already, but this is what moves our minds right now. I am part of the team of the University Hospital of Cologne, and we have seen a patient where we had thrombus, and he came in with pulmonary edema, and he was optical medical therapy, but we could not defibrillate him because he had thrombus, and we did not know what to do with the thrombus, and if we could send him home, and then he has his apoplexia. But we did it. Finally, he was anticoagulated with vitamin K antagonists and frequency controlled. And then we see what happened with that patient. This was before, then he was always under atrial fibrillation, and then he was defibrillated finally when the thrombus was away. And then look what happened to the complete aspect of the patient. This is only the 4-chamber view. You see dilated left atrium, reduced ejection fraction of the left ventricle, the right ventricle we are not talking about because it is not in all these images well depicted. But you see that there's no regional wall motion anomaly. And then this was the beginning of the sinus rhythm. This was 14 days after he was in sinus rhythm. But what is to be seen, that this is a reverse remodeling, reduced ejection fraction, dilated left atrium. At the end, he has a hypertensive heart disease with a typically aortic configuration of the left ventricle, small ventricle, small atrium, incredible, and a normal systolic ejection fraction. And then look what happened with his other parameters. This was when he was under atrial fibrillation. This was just the day after getting back to sinus rhythm. He had a very, very small A wave and a large E wave. And then finally, with that, what we have seen before, the size of the atria, the size of the ventricle we have seen, ejection fraction we see here, we see the smaller ventricle, and we have an E to A ratio, which is really typical for low filling pressures and for diastolic dysfunction degree 1 for hypertensive heart disease, which who are acceptably treated. The same is true then for the atrial strain measurements. But I just wanted to show you what you see, the smaller left atrium. And this is what we are mainly interested to find out in which patients you can really induce a reverse remodeling with atrial fibrillation. It is extremely important that if we send the patients to ablation of atrial fibrillation, we must see them in sinus rhythm if that can be reached at all. And then we want to put in all data. This is body weight, body mass index, atrial hypertension, coronary artery disease, comorbidities, and size of the atria and so far. But this, I would never have expected that this happened, that this would happen when we saw the patient here for the first time. There is, of course, tachymyopathy for the patient with tachycardia and atrial fibrillation. But that this happens means that the fibrosis of the left atrium, I do not know if there was fibrosis, but we believe that this atrial strain is a parameter which really detects atrial fibrosis. But this would mean that atrial myocardial fibrosis would be reversible. So I give anyone the my personal opinion on the way that try to do everything to get the patient to sinus rhythm, and if possible, try to keep them in sinus rhythm. And since we do not know what happens to the left ventricle, we must collect our data, and this is what we do in 3 bigger centers now in Germany. Collect the data that we have prognostic parameters where you can say this is a good candidate and that is for nothing. You should not ablate him at all. These are the informations we need. Okay. So next patient. I must go out here. And have you any questions? No questions? Why do you are happy? Yeah, no question.
We will have a discussion at the end of the session.
At the end of the session. Okay, so I will perhaps there will be questions. If you agree, I will show you one example of a patient which is somewhat strange for me in the understanding. Difficult case, and with aortic stenosis and decompensation, and I did not understand it from the beginning, but we will try to understand them together.
May I have a question regarding atrial fibrillation, any function in atrial fibrillation? Can you please give some comment on left atrial stunning after radio frequency?
No. Directly, I must say, I've seen patients directly after they have been converted to sinus rhythm. They had large A waves, and others, like this patient, 2 days, 3 days after conversion, it did not change anything. He did not show any atrial contraction. So he had a very long stunning, but there is no normal behavior. I have no idea. I really have no idea. And this is individually different. So we must really find a multidisciplinary approach, and of course we'd like to have some ideas on MRI imaging of the fibrosis of the left atrium, but I don't know if you have heard about the results of the Marouche trial, the second Marouche trial, which showed terrible results for prognosis and stunning of patients with more or less fibrosis in the left atrium. So I believe that echo is the best method to follow up the patients. And then after we have collected data of hundreds of patients, we can state that this is a prognostic parameter for fast and longer stunning, or of recovery at all, for remodeling of the left ventricle. The stunning is part of this stunning process. So unfortunately, I cannot give a correct answer right now, but since we will cooperate and find ourselves in Vietnam and in Germany in the next years, we will have answers in the next years. Is it okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to show you another patient. This is very curious for me, the patient. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I have to copy these patients always from my PAC system in the hospital. I must just be a little bit. I thought I had better images here. Just a bit. These are not my images. Okay, so I will reduce this question a little bit more. I have seen that patient, and she had ascites, she had pulmonary edema, not pulmonary edema, pleural effusions, and she had edema in her legs. The old patient, she is 84 years of age, and we had to decide what are the reasons for that. And if you look for the position of the interatrial septum, and you look for the left ventricle, you can say that this patient had a primary diastolic problem of the right heart. If you know that she had pleural effusions and she had thick legs, sorry, Quang? Sorry. Ja. Nee, wir sind nicht fertig. Wir haben noch eine Stunde, oder? Ja, okay. Ja. Alles klar, danke. This was why this was Quang. Huh? He asked me if we are still working. Huh?
Yeah.
We are still working. So we do this case and then we will stop because the others have stopped already, and we discuss a little bit because I can add more and more cases. But I wanted to show you the, you see the clinical question, you see that here, and you believe that this is a diastolic problem of the right heart, more or less. We do not know what is with the pulmonary pressure. We look for the pulmonary pressure and we measure the pulmonary pressure, and this is just a little bit elevated. Okay, so we say that it's not a severe tricuspid regurgitation, and let's look for the right heart, if the right heart contracts normally, because we have the impression that the left ventricle is really okay. Is that okay? So the left ventricle has not a true problem. This was my idea, and I thought we must look for a longer history. There must be something wrong with the right ventricle. The patient had a scar over her breast, and she told us that in 1970, that means it is 51 years before, she had an urgent operation at the birth of her daughter, and she had a complete block of the vena cava superior, but she had a large heart operation. This was between death and life, and but afterwards she had no problems. And I thought that by this operation, the right heart could have some diastolic function problem. And now I go through the heart regular, and I look for everything what happens. And there was a colleague of mine who told me, no, this is a decompensated aortic stenosis. And then we look for these values, and this is just my problem. Do you believe that that patient has a severe she had a maximum gradient of 33 millimeters, a mean gradient of 90 millimeters of mercury with normal heart rate, and a Vmax of 2.9. And she had a little bit aortic regurgitation. This is a very critical question. And my personal belief was not that she had, I give you our data. First of all, we have to look for the valve here. The valve opens, and I do the measurements of the mitral ring. This is all I can get out, 1.8. This is a small aortic ring, but you look for the patient, and the patient has 158 and 47. She has a body surface area of 1.45 millimeters of mercury. And now it is the most important thing is, as I told you before, we have this as the transvalvular problem, velocity, and now we have to look for the subvalvular velocity. And I'd like to find it anyway. I told you how I managed it. I managed it here. This is what in atrial fibrillation, this is, can you see that there is a shadow in the transvalvular gradient? Is that okay? You can see it? And what we do is that we take this as a subvalvular velocity. We take this here as I do that here because this is absolute arrhythmia, and unfortunately the machine does that not automatically. And I go on and go on. Okay, so I call this here left ventricular outflow tract. I call this here left ventricular outflow tract. And I call this here left ventricular outflow tract. And the method measures 0.38 dVi, 0.27 dVi, I don't 0.232, and it measures an opening area of 0.8 to 0.6, and where is the last one? Is I don't know what. Okay, so the question is what to do with that patient. I have judged from my side that this is absolutely atypical for a decompensated aortic stenosis. All those patients who I've seen with a decompensated aortic stenosis have an enlarged ventricle, and the systolic function goes down before they get a pulmonary hypertension. And in all those patients, you have always the interatrial septum to the right side. Can you agree with that? So this, for me, was not a typical aortic stenosis, decompensated, though these values were in some kind at the limit. Okay, we have done the same measurements before, and then the patient was given diuretics. The patient had no problem with the kidney and was in a very good state. I had 3 days later, 2.5 days later, I did the transesophageal echocardiography just to look a little bit more for the valve. And this is what you can get out here. You agree, hopefully, that the left ventricle makes a good impression, that everything is okay. Surely not a problem. Mitral valve is okay. And I'm looking for the tricuspid, for the aortic valve. And you have heard the Jena valve, what Dr. von Bardelem spoke about today. This valve has surely not a typical rheumatic disease. The mitral valve is somewhat curious, but this is, for me, it is not typically rheumatic, but it is stenotic and only very, very, very little calcium. Okay, and now we put it to area measurements, and what we measure is 0.7. And this corresponds exactly to that what we have measured before by the continuity quotient. And still we have the problem that if we call it now AV, if we call it now AV, then it is 0.509 centimeters square. It is a difficult question. And I still believe that this was not a typical aortic stenosis problem. And I looked then, after I have done this year, I looked for the ventricle once again from the other side. That means I looked for the right ventricle now, and I looked for the interatrial septum. Just a minute. And I was completely surprised to see that the interatrial septum, this was for the tricuspid valve, but the interatrial septum definitely goes now from left to right. This is not at all any longer right heart decompensation, it is recovered. And then I did another thing in that patient. I did again the AFI, and from that moment on, I have to say that I'm now, though the ejection fraction of the ventricle is 57%, the contraction pattern of the ventricle looks dramatically pathological. So this fibrosis might be, I've explained before, but the global strain is not so severely reduced, but this here is absolutely typical for reduced contractile function. So in my eyes, this is an atypical form of an decompensated aortic stenosis, and I don't know the etiology of it, and I would not dare to put in TAVI. We must discuss that if that would be a transfemoral approach, but perhaps Jena valve. I don't know if these people implant the Jena valve here in my surgical department. Yes, now we're in Aachen, but this is a critical case which is in any way interesting to discuss with experts from Vietnam. Is it okay? I stop that now.
So do you think that we should do MHCT for this patient to see calcium score?
Yeah, she has no calcium. There's no calcium in. This is a good question, but the calcium score would be very, very low. We could do that, but this helps not for the decision making. I thank you for the question, because I am not at all a fan of calcium scoring, because this has nothing to do with the severity of the disease itself. It is a general question as the Agathon score for everything for coronary arteries. The coronary arteries, if you do it with a very high resolution CT, then you can really look for the coronary arteries, and there are lots of informations. We have heard it this morning already. But the Agathon score or the calcium score, this is my serious, and I discussed it with Van Henyen and all those who have written the German, the European guidelines, and for the Americans, I have no influence. But I think this is an old stuff story with calcium score. This does not help in the clinical decision making. We see that the valve is small. We see that the patient has pure left ventricular contractility, and we see that there is something wrong with the right ventricle. Perhaps it is really decompensated over time, but this is in any way compensated after 3 days of diuretics, and this is a challenging case. We do not know everything about our patients, but doing echo helps a lot to understand pathophysiology.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what about the stroke volume of this patient? And is the patient does the patient has left ventricular hypertrophy? Because this is maybe the one causes of low flow, low gradient, low flow, high gradient, low flow, low gradient with normal ejection fraction.
She has no low flow. It's just I've done this here. I have done it here now with a regular. In that case, I have done it with the regular. Sorry. Sorry. I have to. You can't see it. Sorry. Are you still with me?
Yes.
I have to Bildschirm freigeben. So we have done it here, and she has a cardiac index of 2.6 liters. This is surely no low flow. She has. This is all that is critical. She has a very small aortic subvalvular area. And what we have seen here, just a minute, she has this as after recompensation, she had this here as measurement. This is already a little bit higher than before, yeah? But still, this is a very critical question. And this does not look like decompensation at all. This is difficult to decide. And this is the regurgitation shows that the diastolic function of the left ventricle, this is not a severe regurgitation, but there's a steep short pressure half time. I really do not know. I think the valve is not really calcified, and she has a restricted opening area. We can do dobutamine, but the dobutamine in patients with atrial fibrillation is really not satisfying. This is a true problem. And as far as we do reach a situation where the opening area is much higher than what she had now, you know, the relative opening area is just a little bit more than 0.5. So it is not a really severe aortic stenosis, but she had problems with the right heart. She was partly decompensated, and she has that valve. It is a critical question for me. The problem is we need a valve which should be implanted in 18 to 19 diameter annular ring, which guarantees an opening area of more than 1.2 or 1.3 centimeters square. And there I am a little bit uncertain if that really works. You can do it with the core valve, but it is not really sure. A difficult question, but we can really face all these problems. One can do a CT, of course, but this will not really help us. We know that the coronaries are free. This has been done 6 months ago, and now we have the problem. The only thing we have as pathology is the valve. Okay, I will stop that, and I will tell you next year what happened to the patient. I will propose. Pardon? Anybody?
Yeah.
Anybody talks to us? We should stop.
Yeah. Okay. I have some question. One question is regarding the functional MR quantification in patient with left bundle branch block. So I find it's very difficult, and sometimes we don't know which parameter, vena contracta or EROA or regurgitation volume or regurgitation fraction. Which one should be?
Yeah, you have heard, I do everything, you know, because I do not want to be the enemy of the world. But my favorite, and Paul Grayburn is, I've created at that time, it was in '94. I've been working in Dallas with Paul Grayburn, and there we invented at that time the vena contracta and the long axis. And now to my conference to our congress in November, he was honorary guest speaker, and he's a little bit younger than me. He retires now, but I have asked him that we try to write that down, that the vena contracta in the 3D aspect is the best we can do. We must do it with 3D TEE, but this is the best way. But if you have a left bundle branch block, specifically, this is a problem that must be solved. First of all, we have not talked about resynchronization today. It depends in which kind. My personal opinion for resynchronization is not that it depends on the EKG alone. We must look for the asynchrony, and then if we believe really that this helps the mitral regurgitation to decrease, then we should treat the asynchrony. And anyway, if the EKG is 130 milliseconds or 150 milliseconds, ejection fraction is reduced, one must do it. This is a question. And then to calculate really the degree of the mitral regurgitation is the same what I've told you about before. Any kinds of coapt and mitral FR, we must really do optical, medical, and mechanical therapy. That means also, if in my case the patient had a coronary artery disease, which I did not believe in the specific case, we must treat that and look what happens to the mitral valve. Okay.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And what about the MR quantification in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? We found it very difficult, challenging in many.
It is difficult. It depends on if it is hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. It's you must treat the obstruction, and then because I've seen so many patients, I believe I have shown we have one very famous guy, in my friend and neighbor, who has been operated on hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. He's Olympic winner for swimming, and he has been operated after retiring from sports, and he had exclusively due to the SEM, the regurgitation. And this is a very complicated operation because the redundant anterior leaflet is terrible. The cords are long, but the leaflet itself is too short. You must put in something in the leaflet, and then afterwards, if you have enlarged the anterior leaflet, you must still add an Alfieri stitch. This is very difficult. But on the other hand, the typical hypertensive heart disease, with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and with increasing thickness of the interventricular septum, and then being having a regurgitant valve, this is very complicated case. This can really not be judged just by they must be operated. They don't want to be operated in most cases, and you cannot put in a valve alone. This is extremely difficult to quantify.
Thank you. Because sometimes we have to decide that the surgeon should remove the obstruction alone, or they have to repair the valve as well. Yeah.
Intraoperative echocardiography is a key feature, but the surgeons must have time enough to wait that the stable circulation is recovered, and they do not want to do that. They look if everything is okay for bubbles inside the left ventricle, and then they extract the TE probe, and afterwards you see the result of the operation. This is a big problem, but in our department in surgery where I've been working, everybody has the TE during operation.
Yes, that's wonderful, and we are really we have been really interested in your first part, which you talk about standard normal value in different group patients. That is very, very important. And can you comment about normal value in athletes? Is there any
in what?
In athletes, in sport.
In athletes, of course.
Yeah.
There are there is so many literature outside. If an athlete has a thickened ventricle, this is pathological. It's quite obvious. The only question is can that be remodeled after retiring from sports? This is one question. The second question is there a difference between hypertensive heart, which is trained in the same way, and the concomitant risk factors, or has the athletes no risk factors and has better edge conditions? But ask all these experts, and the best people are André Lagerche is the best in the world for my eyes, and he has normal values. I think normal values are normal values for me and you and for age and everything, and the athletes have no normal values, and then you have to decide. But the problem in athletes specifically are the arrhythmogenic problems, not only of the right heart, but also of the apex and everything, which is contributing to the specific conditions. They have bradycardia under resting conditions, and they have embolism, and they have arrhythmias and everything. Also, sports is one topic which we discuss again this year at our conference, but I do not believe the Italians who say we have everything under control, and I do not believe the Americans. We must restart the whole process and say hypertrophy is pathological, and then we might have to define the conditions around. And we have no experience on reverse remodeling after the retiring from sports.
Wonderful, thank you. And the last question is about the stress echo, exercise echo in pulmonary artery hypertension. Do you think exercise echo is useful?
No.
Yeah.
We have really too little information about that. And pulmonary hypertension, if we know that there is pulmonary hypertension and we are absolutely sure that it is left-sided induced, post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, even in these, no, definitely no. In primary hypertension, if we have primary hypertension, then you must do invasive investigation and you must test the patient. And if the patient has primary PAH, then you have the drugs for that. And if it is a mixed form, we have until now no drug at all, which really helps the patients. And this was one of my questions to von Badeleben. You cannot decide that. I've seen so many patients, and you much more than me, in mitral stenosis. They have definitely, before you dilate the valve, they have definitely pre-capillary pulmonary hypertension. And after 3 days, the pulmonary pressure is normal. And we really must be very careful to believe that we know everything. But if the patient has primary hypertension, stress is not really useful any longer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, excellent explanation. Thank you so much, Professor Wolfgang Fest, for a wonderful day. Especially this afternoon, we enjoy your amazing session with different kind of topics, very broad spectrum case studies.
Thank you. You are too kind. We want to see us, and then we are drinking wine, and then we must have our lives because we love each other. Is that okay?
Wonderful. Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Rest well. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.